Tanks are built to intimidate, to survive, to dominate the battlefield with armor, firepower, and sheer presence.
But not all tanks followed that rulebook. Some were massive mistakes, some were ahead of their time, and some were just insane. This is a journey through the strangest tanks ever built. Machines so weird, so impractical, they never should have made it off the drawing board. But somehow, they did. And each one tells us something about war, ambition, and how not to design a weapon.
Imagine a tank that looks less like a weapon of war and more like something you'd expect to see in a circus act. A perfectly round metal ball on wheels. No turret, no cannon, no visible weaponry, no clear way to steer or aim. It's called the Kugelpanzer, which literally translates to ball tank. And it might be one of the strangest military vehicles ever built. Constructed by Nazi Germany during World War II, the Kugelpanzer remains one of the most mysterious armored vehicles of the era. Unlike the massive Tiger tanks, or the heavily armed panzers that dominated the battlefields of Europe, the Kugelpanzer is a tiny, one-man machine, fully enclosed in armor, shaped like a sphere, and fitted with narrow slits for vision. It appears to roll forward on two large cylindrical wheels with a small stabilizing wheel in the rear to keep it from toppling over. But beyond its bizarre design, almost nothing is known for certain about it. There's no official documentation, no blueprints, no records of deployment. We don't know who designed it, how many were built, or even what battlefield role it was supposed to fill. It has no armament, at least none that survives, and no signs of a gun mount or firing system. Was it meant to scout ahead of the main force, deliver messages under fire, lay cables, distract enemy forces with its absurdity? The only surviving Kugelpanzer was captured by the Soviet Red Army in 1945 during the Manchurian campaign, far from the European front. This oddity was reportedly seized from a Japanese military facility, which only deepens the mystery. What was a German prototype doing in the Far East? Was it gifted to Japan, shared as part of the Axis collaboration, or simply being tested overseas? Today, the sole remaining unit sits silently in the Kugelpanzer Tank Museum near Moscow. It's sealed, stripped of identifying markings, and surrounded by more questions than answers. Historians and engineers have speculated endlessly about its purpose, everything from reconnaissance to psychological warfare. But without documentation or internal components to study, it remains a riddle encased in steel. In the annals of military engineering, few designs are as jaw-droppingly absurd as the Tsar Tank, a vehicle so bizarre it looked more at home in a steampunk fantasy novel than on the battlefield. Imagine a giant tricycle built for war. Instead of using tracks like most tanks, this Russian monstrosity rolled on two colossal front wheels, each nearly 9 meters in height, and a much smaller rear wheel for support. Developed during the early stages of World War I in 1914, the Tsar Tank was an ambitious experiment in overcoming battlefield obstacles. The theory behind the design was, in principle, clever. The enormous wheels would allow the vehicle to roll effortlessly over trenches, debris, and rough terrain, a major problem for conventional vehicles at the time. At full size, it stood taller than a 2-story house and spanned more than 17 meters from front to back. It was meant to be intimidating, revolutionary, unstoppable, at least on paper. In reality, the Tsar Tank was an unmitigated disaster. During its first and only field trial, the massive front wheels performed exactly as expected, gliding over the uneven ground with ease. But then came the rear wheel, tiny by comparison and not built for soft or uneven terrain. It immediately sank into the ground. The tank tilted backward and got stuck. Engineers attempted to free it, but nothing worked. The 60-ton behemoth simply couldn't budge. And while it may have looked terrifying, there was one more crucial problem. It wasn't armed. Despite its massive structure, the prototype never had its weaponry installed. No cannons, no machine guns, nothing. The intended design included several gun emplacements that would allow it to fire in multiple directions, but by the time of testing, none were operational. The Tsar Tank never fired a shot. It never saw combat. It never even moved again. After the failure, the project was quickly shelved. The prototype was left exactly where it broke down, slowly rusting away in an empty field, becoming a strange relic of military overconfidence. It remained there, untouched for years before finally being dismantled and scrapped in the late 1920s. When war comes knocking and you don't have the tools to fight it, you get creative. Or in the case of New Zealand during World War II, you get very creative. Lacking both the heavy industry and the manufacturing capacity of larger nations, New Zealand faced a harsh reality. They had no tanks of their own, no factories to build them, no designs ready to go. But they had determination and tractors. Enter the Semple Tank, one of the most improvised and arguably absurd armored vehicles ever constructed. Named after Bob Semple, the then Minister of Public Works, this tank was built using a standard Caterpillar D8 bulldozer as its base. Around it, engineers welded together a shell of corrugated iron, the same material used for farm sheds and roofing. The result was a boxy, lumbering beast that looked more like an armored barn than a weapon of war. Inside, things weren't much better. The tank was designed to be crewed by 6 men who had to operate machine guns from narrow slits and holes cut directly into the sides of the vehicle. There were no turrets, no gun sights, and the crew had no proper seating. They simply stood or crouched as the vehicle rattled and shook violently over uneven terrain. The ride was so rough that aiming any of the machine guns accurately was nearly impossible. Despite its intimidating size and loud engine, the Semple Tank offered almost no real protection. The corrugated iron plating couldn't stop anything more powerful than small arms fire, and even then, only at certain angles. Its massive size made it an easy target, and its top speed was just 24 kilometers per hour, 15 miles per hour, on a good day. To make matters worse, the tank was never actually tested in combat. It was more of a morale booster than a military asset, a symbol to reassure the public that New Zealand was doing something to prepare for potential invasion. The military quickly realized its limitations, and the project was quietly dropped after a few prototypes were built. Sometimes bigger isn't better, and the Panzer VIII Maus is the perfect example of when ambition outgrows practicality. Conceived during the later stages of World War II, the Maus was Adolf Hitler's personal dream project, a tank so massive, so indestructible, that it could crush enemy defenses simply by rolling through them. And in terms of size, it absolutely delivered. Weighing a staggering 188 tons, the Maus was by far the heaviest tank ever built. It dwarfed anything the Allies had on the battlefield, both in size and in sheer intimidation. Armed with a massive 128mm Kampfwagen cannon of 44 L55 main gun, capable of penetrating virtually any armor of the time, and supported by a coaxial 75mm secondary gun, the Maus wasn't short on firepower. Its armor was equally extreme, over 200mm thick at the front, making it theoretically impervious to most Allied anti-tank weapons. But all that protection and firepower came at an enormous cost. The Maus was a logistical disaster. It was too heavy to cross standard bridges, meaning it had to either ford rivers, which was risky and impractical, or use special equipment to cross. Its top speed? A pathetic 13 kilometers per hour, 8 miles per hour, assuming it didn't get bogged down. It needed multiple engines to move and required a second support vehicle just to refuel it. Transporting it by rail was nearly impossible, and even moving it across open terrain proved a challenge. Only 2 prototypes were ever completed. One was destroyed by the Germans themselves to prevent it from falling into Allied hands. The other was captured by the Soviets and eventually taken back to Russia, where it still exists today as a museum exhibit. An enormous steel relic of misguided ambition. Long before the modern tank battles of World War II, France set out to create something that would dominate the battlefield, not just in power, but in sheer size and presence. The result was the Char 2C, a land battleship in every sense of the word. At the time of its creation in the early 1920s, it was the largest operational tank in the world. Measuring an incredible 10.3 meters in length, over 33 feet, and standing nearly 4 meters tall, the Char 2C looked like something pulled from the pages of science fiction. It was a steel leviathan, crewed by 12 men, with multiple compartments, multiple turrets, and heavy armor. Its primary armament was a 75mm gun, mounted in a rotating turret, the first of its kind on a tank of that size, backed by several machine guns stationed along the hull and rear. Built in extremely limited numbers, only 10 were ever produced, the Char 2C was not just a tank, but a political statement. It was meant to showcase French industrial might after the devastation of World War I. With its enormous frame and intimidating silhouette, it looked unstoppable. The French military paraded it through cities, filmed it rolling across fields, and presented it as a symbol of national strength and engineering superiority. But despite its impressive appearance, the Char 2C was already obsolete by the time World War II began. Its massive size made it hard to transport. It was slow, with a top speed of just 15 kilometers per hour, 9 miles per hour, and mechanically unreliable. Its armor, though thick for its time, couldn't stand up to newer anti-tank weapons. And on the battlefield of 1940, it was simply too large, too heavy, and too outdated to be useful. In reality, it was never deployed for combat. As Nazi Germany's blitzkrieg swept across France, the decision was made to destroy the Char 2Cs rather than allow them to be captured. Most were blown up by French forces during transport or abandoned and sabotaged. Some were captured by the Germans in unusable condition, who reportedly used them only for propaganda photos. The T-28 super heavy tank wasn't designed to fight alongside other tanks. It wasn't built for speed or agility or even flexibility. It was built for one thing: to smash through anything in its path. A fortress on tracks, a rolling bunker, and one of the heaviest armored vehicles the United States has ever produced. Developed near the end of World War II, the T-28 was a response to the terrifying challenge of breaching the German Siegfried Line, a network of bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and fortified positions stretching across Western Germany. To take it down, conventional tanks weren't going to cut it, so US engineers designed a machine that could crawl straight through enemy defenses without flinching. The T-28 had 4 sets of tracks, 2 on each side, to help distribute its massive weight. Its armor was up to 300 millimeters thick, more than triple that of a standard Sherman tank, intended to resist the most powerful anti-tank weapons of the time. Instead of a rotating turret, it featured a fixed 105 millimeter gun mounted directly into the hull, designed for frontal assaults against bunkers and fortifications. But all that armor came at a cost: mobility. With a top speed of just 13 kilometers per hour, 8 miles per hour, the T-28 moved at a walking pace. It couldn't pivot quickly. It was too wide for most roads and far too heavy for standard bridges, and transporting it by rail was a logistical nightmare. The outer tracks could be removed for transit, but it still required special equipment and advanced planning just to get it from point A to point B. By the time the T-28 was operational, the war in Europe had ended. The Siegfried Line had fallen, and the need for a bunker-busting behemoth vanished overnight. Only 2 prototypes were ever completed. One was destroyed during testing. The other was quietly mothballed, left in storage, and eventually forgotten. For decades, its existence was little more than a rumor, until in the 1970s, the surviving prototype was rediscovered sitting in a yard at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, weathered but still intact. It was eventually moved to the National Armor and Cavalry Museum, where it remains today as a massive reminder of what might have been. When most people picture a tank, they imagine a rotating turret perched on top, swinging from side to side, locking onto targets, and unleashing firepower from a distance. But in the cold forests of Scandinavia, Sweden had a very different idea. Enter the Stridsvagn 103, better known as the S-Tank, a turretless tank that broke almost every rule in the armored warfare playbook. Developed in the 1960s during the height of the Cold War, the Stridsvagn 103 was designed with one goal in mind: defense. Sweden, a neutral country surrounded by NATO and Warsaw Pact powers, knew it couldn't compete with the massive armored divisions of larger nations. So instead of building tanks that could charge into battle, it focused on building one that could hide, strike, and survive. Unlike traditional tanks, the Stridsvagn 103 had no rotating turret. Its main gun, a powerful 105mm cannon, was mounted directly into the hull. To aim, The driver had to pivot the entire vehicle left or right and adjust elevation by tilting the suspension. It was a concept that seemed bizarre at first, but thanks to an advanced hydropneumatic suspension system, it worked surprisingly well. The tank could lower itself into defensive positions, peek over ridgelines, or sit almost flat against the terrain, making it incredibly difficult to detect or hit. It was also packed with innovative features. The S-Tank had 2 engines, one diesel for fuel efficiency and one gas turbine jet engine for sudden bursts of speed. It could be operated entirely by 3 crew members, with some versions designed to be driven even from the rear in reverse. It had an autoloader, unusual for its time, amphibious capability, and could be camouflaged so well it would nearly disappear into the landscape. Despite all its radical choices, the Stridsvagn 103 proved to be remarkably effective in testing and exercises. It never saw real combat, but it served in the Swedish military for over 3 decades, from the late 1960s until the 1990s. NATO observers were consistently impressed by its low profile, fast firing cycle, and defensive capabilities. While many nations during the 20th century experimented with building bigger, heavier, and more heavily armed tanks, Imperial Japan took a very different approach, one that led to one of the smallest armored vehicles ever used in warfare, the Type 94 Tankette. Developed in the early 1930s, the Type 94 was less a tank and more a motorized metal box on tracks. It measured just 3.08 meters long, about the size of a compact car, and stood barely over 1.6 meters tall. It weighed just over 3.4 tons and was manned by a crew of 2, a driver and a gunner. Its primary weapon? A single 6.5 meter or 7.7 meter machine gun. Fine for infantry suppression, but practically useless against any armored threat. It was officially classified as a Tankette, a category meant for scouting, reconnaissance, and infantry support, not head-on combat. The idea was to have a fast, mobile platform that could help Japanese infantry units move quickly through rough terrain, especially in China and Southeast Asia, where infrastructure was limited and the enemy was often poorly mechanized. Its armor was only 6 to 12 millimeter thick, offering little more protection than a steel plate. It could stop small arms fire from certain angles, but even high-powered rifles or concentrated machine gun fire posed a serious threat. Grenades, mines, or anti-tank rifles would tear through it with ease. Worse, the crew inside had no real protection from heat or shock, and the cramped interior made long operations miserable. Despite these flaws, over 800 units were produced, and the Type 94 was widely deployed in China, Manchuria, and later in the Pacific during World War II. But as the war progressed and Japanese forces began encountering better-equipped Allied armies, the Tankette's limitations became painfully clear. Against Shermans, Stuarts, or even lightly armored vehicles, the Type 94 had no chance. It couldn't fight, it couldn't run, and it certainly couldn't survive. In many cases, Type 94s were destroyed en masse, abandoned, or used in desperate suicide missions during the final phases of the war. Some were even buried or converted into stationary gun platforms, a grim end for an already underwhelming machine. In the interwar years, military designers were gripped by an idea that seemed logical, at least on paper. If one turret is good, then more turrets must be better. Enter the T-35, the Soviet Union's bold experiment in armored overkill. It was a tank so large, so bristling with weapons, it looked more like a rolling fortress than a practical fighting vehicle. Introduced in the early 1930s, the T-35 was designed as a breakthrough tank, intended to smash through fortified enemy positions with overwhelming firepower. To do that, it featured not 1, not 2, but 5 separate turrets. A main central turret with a 76.2mm cannon, 2 turrets with 45mm guns, and 2 additional turrets with machine guns. It required a crew of 11 to operate, drivers, gunners, loaders, commanders, each with their own stations, and often poor communication between them. At over 9 meters long and weighing around 50 tons, the T-35 was an imposing sight. On parade through Red Square, it inspired awe. It looked like an unstoppable beast, the very embodiment of Soviet military might. But looks were deceiving. Its enormous size made it slow and cumbersome, with a top speed of just 28 kilometers per hour, 17 miles per hour. And that was under ideal conditions. Its armor was relatively thin for its weight, and the layout of its turrets made coordinating firepower incredibly complicated. Worse still, the tank was notoriously mechanically unreliable. It had a tendency to break down frequently, and spare parts were in short supply. During the early days of World War II, particularly in the 1941 German invasion of the Soviet Union, the T-35 was deployed in limited numbers, but its performance was disastrous. Of the fewer than 60 units ever built, the majority were lost not in battle, but due to breakdowns, getting stuck in terrain, or being abandoned by their crews when they failed to move. Some were destroyed by German forces, but many were simply left behind and blown up by retreating Soviet troops to avoid capture. The tank that was supposed to embody Soviet strength became instead a symbol of flawed military theory, of complexity without reliability, of ambition that exceeded practicality. Not every strange tank was a failure. Some were bold experiments, testing new concepts that would later influence future generations of armored vehicles. A few pushed the boundaries of what was possible, in engineering, in design, in battlefield strategy. But for most, their fate was far less glorious. They were too slow, too heavy, too weird, or just too flawed. Many never fired a shot. Some never even left the testing ground. And today, they rest in museums, storage yards, or old black and white photographs, remembered more for their oddity than their impact. Because in war, the strangest ideas sometimes roll, but they almost never survive.